So as many of you may know who are diehard fans like me, Bridgerton Season 2 is coming out March 25th. And like many of you in the world, I am so freaking excited. So I figured that this was probably the perfect time to go grab all of the books, or most of the books in the series, and basically binge read them before the show comes out. Hey everyone, it's JEN-nuh-nee and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. Today I am going to be expressing my Bridgerton love and reading the books in the series and giving you a little bit of a review on each of them as I read them throughout the next couple of weeks before the release of the second season of the show. So the show comes out March 25th and it's currently March 12th today when I'm filming this intro. I have already read the first two books so far, and I'm going to be reading the next three books as well of the series, which follow the other Bridgerton siblings in the show. And I'm hoping that after reading all of these books, I'll feel really hyped for the second season. Just for context, when the first season of the show came out originally, I didn't really know too much about it, but just seeing the trailer for it, I got super excited because it was a Regency romance. I absolutely love Jane Austen novels, and it just seemed like the perfect thing that I would enjoy, and so I definitely went ahead and binged it the second it came out. I fell in love with it, and I meant to read the books way back then, but never got around to it, and so with the second season coming out, I knew I needed to get ahead and read the books before the second season came out. I'm particularly excited for the second season as well because the main character, Kate, is played by a South Asian woman. She's Tamil Indian, Simone Ashley, and if you guys didn't know, I'm Tamil, and seeing this representation is all I really live for, and she's just gorgeous, and I am so excited to see her on screen and see her and Antony's romance in the second season, so I'm just overall really hyped. So as I said, I'm going to be reading these 5 books in the Bridgerton series by Julia Quinn. I'm going with these 5. There are like, I think 3 more books with the younger 3 siblings of the Bridgerton family, and I personally don't really care for those characters that much at this moment because we haven't really seen much of them in the show, so I'm not like super excited for them, and I feel like they are books that I could probably read later if we end up getting more of those characters in the show. So I want to focus on these 5 books and these 5 siblings in the Bridgerton family. So the first book is The Duke and I, which features Daphne's story that we know from the first season. The second book is The Viscount Who Loved Me, which features Antony's story, which we'll be seeing in the second season. The third book is An Offer from a Gentleman, and this is actually Benedict's story, which I'm super excited for because I love his character in the show and I think he's hilarious, so I'm curious to see how this will go. The fourth book is Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, and this features both Colin and Penelope's story. And I'm super excited for this one because of the things we know about Penelope from the show, and this should be very interesting. And then the last book that I'll be picking up, which is the 5th book in the series, is To Sir Phillip with Love, and this is Eloise's story. Eloise is probably my favorite character from the Bridgerton show and like from the family of them, so I cannot wait to see how she falls in love. So those are all the books on the docket for this video. I'm going to be vlogging this experience and giving you my review on each, and I just want to say that if you are watching this video and you haven't watched season 1 of the show, you're gonna get spoiled, so please go watch it before you watch this video. And if you don't want to know anything about the books, you don't want to get spoiled about like future things that could happen in the show, it's probably not a good idea to watch this video because I'm going to be spoiling myself by reading the books, but I'm excited because I feel like the show has taken a lot of liberties and sort of added extra content to the books, which makes it a little bit more exciting and fun to watch. As I said when I'm filming this intro clip, I have already read the first 2 books, so I've already seen the additions that they've made in the show, and it's been really interesting to sort of experience that. So those are just the disclaimers that I'm putting out here. Let's get into my thoughts on The Duke and I. I definitely ended up enjoying this one a lot more than I expected to, which is saying something. I think I went into the series expecting it to be very traditional romance and sort of the type of thing that I wouldn't really enjoy. But I found myself the entire time falling in love with the banter of the characters and their chemistry on the page. I think one thing that the show doesn't do justice to is showing the chemistry between the characters that is beyond the sexual tension. I think they're really good at the sexual tension and sort of the longing glances, but I think some of the romantic aspects are done a teeny bit better in the books, just because we get more context, we get more scenes, and we get to see them sort of talk together more and how they would sort of act on a regular basis, which I kind of really loved. As many people know, this book in particular and the first season of the show has a really problematic scene in it, which involves consent. I'm not going to go into the details, but I do think that as opposed to the show, the book is actually not as bad. The book really shows it as a spur of the moment thing, which again, not great also, but the show definitely portrays it as more of a premeditated thing that Daphne does, which makes it sort of worse, I think, personally. I don't know. I would love to discuss this aspect. Let me know what you think of the difference between the book and the show when it comes to that scene, if you've read the book, because personally I think that it's not as bad in the book. It's definitely awful, but it's not as bad in the book. And I can definitely see how this, having been published so many years ago, kind of got past the checkpoints in traditional publishing and, you know, was put out like this. Irregardless of those issues, I think this book was actually a lot of fun. I loved seeing their personalities. I actually really liked Daphne as a character a little bit more than I like her in the show. But two things that surprised me the most about sort of getting into this book was one, how little of these side characters and other siblings we actually get in the book. I feel like the book is really focused on the two main characters and the main romance, and so we get small little tidbits of everyone else, but there's actually not much content about the other siblings in the book itself, which is surprising because this is like 400 pages, but it's like literally all Simon and Daphne. But whereas in the show, we get so many other plot lines with all these different characters, and I'm starting to think that a lot of those plot lines are coming from later books in the series where those characters get to be the main characters, or maybe it's just stuff that they've added to the story. There are definitely plot points in the first season that do not show up at all in this book. A couple in particular are the prince character, who is like not even a character in this book, and also the queen. She's not even a character in the book, and I don't even think in the later books either. And so I feel like both of those characters are added for increased tension in the story and increased stakes, and I actually really love those additions, but it's just interesting to see that they're not even in the books. Another thing that's not in the book is the whole situation with Colin and with the character in the show who gets pregnant. I forget her name, but she was like a major subplot in the show in that first season. So it was really interesting to see that she wasn't even a character in the book, but I'm curious to see if she like shows up in Colin's book later on in the series, or if she's just an addition to the show that they added both for like Colin's sort of storyline, but also really for Penelope. I think she really adds to Penelope's story as well. So I just find it all really interesting, like the choices that the showrunners decided to make and the plot lines that they decided to add to the show to sort of amp it all up. One thing I noticed particularly while reading this book was how much I actually really liked Anthony in this book. Anthony is actually portrayed as a bit of an ass in the show. He is horrible in the way that he doesn't listen to Daphne through most of the beginning of the show, but I feel like in the books he's actually quite supportive and he is there for Daphne at many points, and he is definitely not trying to shove this like marriage down her throat and, you know, make her be with someone that she doesn't want to be with. He is obviously concerned for her, and one thing that actually happens in the book that I don't think happens in the show is that Simon and Daphne actually come clean to Anthony quite early in their fake dating situation. And the entire time Anthony's like, don't fall for each other, he's a rake, you shouldn't be with him, and all of that, but it's really out of concern. And he's honestly just like less of an ass. And I really liked him in the book. I kind of wish he was more like the book Anthony in the show, but I feel like part of the reason why he is the way he is in the show is to up the progression of his character arc and see the way that he changes, hopefully, in this second season. So overall, I felt like this was a great read, fun romance, loved, you know, the chemistry between the characters. This wasn't my favorite like storyline, I would say. I have heard from many of you who have read the entire series that the later books are actually much better, so I'm excited. I'd probably rate this one a 3.5 stars. It was fun, enjoyable, definitely not the best thing I've read, but I do really love Julia Quinn's writing. She definitely feels like a more accessible Jane Austen, and just the way she writes her characters and the romance and just the writing itself feels very Jane Austen, so I'm loving the vibes. And those are basically my major thoughts about this first book. I will get back to you on the second. Alrighty friends, book 2, The Viscount Who Loved Me, Antony's story. Just right off the bat, I really, really loved this one. This was definitely more of a favorite than The Duke and I. I love the way that Antony and Kate's relationship progresses across the book, and also the way that the theme of grief played a really major part in this story. As I said in my review of The Duke and I definitely think that Antony is way less of an ass in the books than he is in the show. He really gets on my nerves in the show, but in the books, he is such a sweetie. He has way more depth to him, I feel like, or at least that we get to see. And I just really think that he is a lot more of a caring character than he appears in the show. I feel like the show also ups this sense of conflict between Antony and his mother, whereas their relationship in this book in particular is so sweet, especially because they're both sort of grieving his father and trying to get through that together. There are scenes with them in their old home where they're remembering his father, and they were just so touching, and I just felt for Antony so much. Aside from absolutely loving Antony's character in this book, I also really loved Kate Sheffield. So in the book, her name is Kate Sheffield and her younger sister is Edwina, but in the show, they have changed the names to fit the actresses who are playing the characters, and so it's Kate Sharma and Edwina Sharma. As I said at the beginning of this video, I'm so excited for season 2 because Kate is played by a South Asian woman. I am South Asian, she's also Tamil, I'm also Tamil, and so I'm super excited for that representation, and also all the things that they're going to be adding to the story to sort of fit that representation. But irregardless of that, I actually really love Kate's character in this book, and also her sister's character, and the way that the story really takes a hate to love sort of format or trope. So they start out really not liking each other, and Kate not wanting him to court her younger sister. But of course, as the book progresses, they start to fall for each other. And just seeing the way that their opinion of each other changes as they get to know each other better was just so great and just a wonderful romance. I also love that in this book, Kate was a bit of an older character. They're talking about how she's like almost a spinster when she's like only 25 or something. Actually, maybe even younger. I feel like she was like 22 or something. But she has a little bit more experience, I would say, than Daphne does in the first book, and so that was a bit of a refreshing take as well. Overall, this was so much fun, had so many great scenes. The Pall Mall scene was so fantastic, and I can't wait to see how they bring it to life on screen. And I think overall, I just really enjoyed my time with this one a little bit more than The Duke and I, just because I also didn't know the story going into it, so I was surprised by more things. And I also just personally liked Antony and Kate's characters more in this book than I liked Simon and Daphne. This book also had some like really just heartwarming scenes towards the end, just like, you know, cuddle up on a Sunday morning and read this because it's just so sweet and cute type of scenes, which I loved. Overall, I think I'm just super excited to see this on screen, having read it first, because I feel like the show just adds so many other extra bits and, you know, extra stakes, that having read the book first is going to make it a lot more fun, because I've already fallen in love with the characters and now I'm just going to get to see more of them. I feel like this experiment is going really well, so I can't wait to read the next books in the series. I'd love to hear from you guys though. Which is your favorite scene from this book, and which one are you most excited to see adapted for screen? Those are all my thoughts on the Viscount Who Loved Me. I will get back to you on the next book, An Offer from a Gentleman. Alrighty friends, book 3, An Offer from a Gentleman. So this is Benedict's story, and guys, this was definitely my favorite so far. I'm pretty sure it's going to be my favorite of the entire series, but I don't want to call it yet. I don't want to jinx it. We'll see. It was so fantastic, and I had actually put up a poll to you guys on my Instagram asking what your favorite book of the series was if you had read it, and a lot of you had said like either the second one or like this one or a later one, whatever, but a lot of you did mention that this one was really cheesy. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. But I understand why many of you said that. It's because this book is structured like a Cinderella story. It is basically a Cinderella story. So the main character, Sophie, is the illegitimate bastard of this earl, and he gets remarried when she's like 10 or something. She has these 2 daughters. She's awful. She's definitely like the evil stepmother, and her father ends up dying. And so rather than being like this fake ward of his like distant cousin, which is what he was telling everyone, she ends up being relegated to a servant, basically a slave to her stepmother, and just having this really awful time growing up. She goes from being someone of higher status as this like ward and getting demoted to a lower class. And so she's the person who Benedict falls in love with in this book. And I honestly, from like page 1 to the end, was so captivated by this story. And I think part of the reason is because the reasons that they can't be together are much larger than themselves. Rather than a personal flaw or like trauma or something affecting their relationship, it's because of, you know, larger societal issues that they can't be together. She is of a different class, and so they have to sort of work through that and figure it out. And she also just like has all of this like past and history that she doesn't really want to share with him, and so it's a matter of like figuring that out as well. So I'm sure a lot of people didn't really love the whole Cinderella thing or thought it was too cheesy or dramatic or whatever, but I personally loved it. It was what made the book for me. It just made it so much more exciting and fun. There's a lot more, I feel like, drama to this and like stakes to it than the other 2 books had. I do feel like the show adds a lot more stakes, but this book in particular had the most stakes out of the other books. I also just loved Benedict in this book. He was fantastic. I'd always loved Benedict. I love him in the show. I love every time he appears in the first 2 books, but we got to see a lot more of him. We get to see him and his art, which is one thing I think that they sort of plucked from his book and start showing a lot more earlier in the show, because it doesn't really show up in the first and second books. He was definitely like very arrogant and annoying and frustrating at some points, but I still found him endearing and like he was a fun character to follow. And he was also very sort of self-aware of when he was being stupid and arrogant. Like he would say something dumb and he'd be like, okay, that was dumb, but I don't care kind of thing. Or he would apologize for it later. I just feel like he was a lot more endearing than Simon or Anthony was, in my opinion. Like I liked him as a character a lot more. On the note of loving characters, I absolutely loved Sophie. She's probably my favorite heroine of the 3 that I've seen. I really do love Kate as well, but Sophie was just so fun. She's definitely like the more feisty character who doesn't take people's shit. She punches people out multiple times in this book, which I absolutely love. And she's fighting against this need to be subservient and, you know, act like a servant, but also like not taking people's shit, which I loved. She definitely had that like gumption and feistiness to her, and she was just so awesome. But she was also just like a regular girl who dreamed of going to a ball at the beginning and ends up in this sticky situation. Another thing I loved about this is that we got a lot more of the side characters, including Lady Bridgerton or Violet. She plays a lot more of a part in this book, especially in like the second half, which I loved. And we also get to see a lot more of the younger girl siblings in the Bridgerton family. So we get to see a lot more Eloise. And I love seeing the dynamic between Benedict and Eloise because I think they have a wonderful dynamic in the show. So seeing more of that in the books was really great. And we also get to hear a lot more from Francesca and Hyacinth as well. They are much older in this book, so we get to see them interacting with the other characters and just like hearing more of what they're like. So I thought that was interesting. They are still slightly interchangeable in my head, so I'm hoping the later books will sort of fix that as we get into their stories later on. So that's my hope. And then another major thing I wanted to mention is that this book, although the first like couple chapters take place shortly after Anthony's story, so the Viscount Who Loved Me, the rest of the book actually takes place 3 years later. So our 2 main characters sort of fatefully meet one night when she sort of goes to this masquerade ball at the Bridgerton house, and she's sort of disguising herself as this lady and not as a servant. And she goes and they find each other and fall for each other, but they just have that one night and she runs off into the night like Cinderella and is never to be heard from again. And 3 years pass since that first meeting that they have, and so they both sort of created this fiction of each other in their heads and fallen in love with each other in their heads, which I thought was just so beautiful and poetic and like just hit me in the feels. I love stories like that where they like fall in love over a single night or day or whatever and are pining for each other afterwards. But the time jump definitely like surprised me because I felt like I'm curious to see how they're going to handle it in the show and if they're going to make it a significant time jump or if they're going to just put things a lot closer together, because I do feel like that also affects the later books, because in the next book, which I'm currently reading, it also is many years later. Like it's many years after even this book. So there's a lot of time jumps going on and people getting older. So I find it really interesting and I'm curious to see how they're going to handle it in the show. And then finally, one thing I really enjoyed about this one is that at the end of this book, they really sort of set up the next book, which is the one with Penelope and Colin. And we know many things about Penelope from the show, especially from the first season. And so there's sort of like a setup for that next book at the end of this one, because there's like a catalyzing moment at the end of this book that changes things for Penelope in the next book. which I found super interesting, and I loved how it was done. And I do feel like the author sort of made a more conscious effort to sort of connect the stories together from the second book onwards, just to make it flow a little bit better, which I loved. So yeah, overall, loved this so much. Definitely my fave of the series. Like, I don't think the other ones are gonna top it, but we'll see. I still have high hopes for Eloise's story because I love Eloise, but I have heard some people were quite disappointed by that one, so we'll see. And then the last thing I want to say is that I am so excited to see who is going to be playing Sophie for this book and for like the third season if we get one, because I feel like whoever plays it is really going to make or break Sophie's character, because she's just so awesome, and I just want like the perfect person to play her, the perfect person who can like embody her character. So I'm really excited for that. And with that said, I will check back with you later once I have read the next book, Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. Alrighty, book 4, Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. So this is Penelope and Colin's story, as we know. And honestly, guys, this was a bit of a letdown. I had high hopes for the book that, as we know, would be Lady Whistledown's book. But I do feel like this fell short for me in a lot of ways, mainly in the romance. I feel like the book was so focused on the Lady Whistledown aspects and sort of Penelope as well that the romance was kind of lacking, at least in my opinion. I just didn't really love the dynamic between Colin and Penelope. I like that they're old friends and that they've known each other for so long, and then he sort of realizes that he has come to love her, but I didn't particularly love him as a character. I have always thought that he was a little bit like the Domja in the show and the earlier books. I do love his relationship with his other brothers, but I don't think he on his own is that interesting, in my opinion at least. But it was interesting to find out that he was a writer and that he had these travel journals that he would write, and all that was cool, but I just felt like it didn't match up with what we sort of have seen of Colin before. I didn't really believe that he had this like internal dialogue sort of going on, and I particularly didn't love how he was sort of jealous of Penelope's success as Lady Whistledown and how that sort of affected their relationship, especially in the second half of the book. So all of that just made me not like him as a character or a love interest, and I just honestly thought that she could do better. But overall, I think the book did focus a lot on like sort of the whole Lady Whistledown reveal and everything. One thing I didn't really like though was that because the book was so focused on sort of like slightly and slowly parsing out this mystery, we didn't really get to connect to Penelope fully from the beginning. We know something's suspicious and we have a suspicion that she might be Lady Whistledown, and there's this whole challenge put forth by Lady Danbury with this reward if someone can uncover Lady Whistledown. But I feel like because it was like a secret from the beginning, even to the reader, it was slightly frustrating to read from Penelope's perspective and not get all of the details. Like everything was just very secretive, if that makes sense. So obviously I knew that she was Lady Whistledown from the show because it's revealed in the first season. So I knew that going into it, and I had a little bit extra context, but I feel like I just couldn't connect to Penelope as a character for like most of the first half of the book until it was revealed and until we got more of the backstory of how she started Lady Whistledown and, you know, how that all came to be. I feel like that part was also like really glossed over. I feel like I would have loved like a full-on explanation and more in-depth explanation of how she became Lady Whistledown and how all of that came about. I feel like that was the most interesting part and the part I was looking forward to the most, and we didn't get much of that, and I just didn't really like the dynamic between these two. I do like them both in the other books, but I feel like on their own I just didn't really love them as much as I was hoping to. So I don't know, this book was like sort of a miss for me. I definitely don't think it was like horrible or not enjoyable. It was still enjoyable. It still had fun parts. I loved still seeing some of the side characters and stuff. I did love like the moments where Colin goes to like Daphne for advice, and I also really love like the parts between Penelope and Eloise. But one thing that bothered me about that whole situation was that Penelope never tells Eloise that she's Lady Whistledown, and that Eloise doesn't really get a moment at the end of this book to react to the whole reveal that Penelope is Lady Whistledown. There's no like moment where she's like, oh my god, you're my best friend and you didn't tell me this. None of that happens, and I'm actually reading the next book and it doesn't occur in that book either, which is why I'm like very confused. Like, how could you be best friends for 10 plus years and not even discuss the fact that your friend has been keeping this like giant secret from you for 10 years? I don't know. I did find the whole idea of Penelope doing this for 10 years and sort of getting tired of it really interesting. I loved that whole look into her secret life and how she had this like burning desire to not let Cressida take credit for her work and her life's achievement. That was really cool. So I think overall Penelope as a character was really cool. One thing I was thinking as I was reading this and sort of thinking back to what I know about season 2, so I am telling you all of this before I've seen season 2, and one of the trailers or like extra content stuff about season 2 said that Colin is returning from a trip in Greece. There's like this whole part at the beginning of the book where Lady Whistledown thinks that Colin is returning from Greece, and that's what she like puts in her papers and everything, and that's what everyone thinks. But it turns out that he was actually in Cyprus, and that's where he was, and that's where he's returning from at the beginning of this book, when he returns and starts to see Penelope in a new light. And so the fact that there's promotional material floating about that says that he went to Greece and that he's back after this long trip has me thinking that potentially they're going to be moving the storyline of this book up earlier into season 2, or at least part of the storyline from this book into season 2, to just add some extra jazz to the story. Because given that they've revealed Penelope's identity at the end of season 1 to the viewers at least, I feel like they're going to continue that thread of sort of figuring out who Lady Whistledown is and trying to move forward with that storyline. I also don't know how many seasons of the show we're actually going to get, so they might be trying to condense some of the storylines together. Regardless, I think it's going to be super cool, and I'm excited to see what they're going to do with Colin and Penelope, just because knowing that they added so much extra for the first season with Colin's story, I feel like there's a potential for other things to go on in the second season. With that said, this was by no means my favorite. Definitely a lower point in the series, for me at least, as opposed to the third book, which I really loved, but I'm still holding out hope that the next one will be better. Alrighty friends, we are on to book 5, To Sir Philip with Love. And this is Eloise's story. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I love Eloise. She's probably my favorite character out of the Bridgertons, from the show especially. And I also loved her in a lot of the early books, but I do feel like she's less of a presence in the books than she is in the show. And this book, I must say, in terms of the romance, was quite a bit of a letdown, much like Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. There was something about both these books where I feel like the character stuff was good, but the sort of romance itself and the chemistry between the characters wasn't really there for me, at least. But basically with Eloise, we learn in some of the earlier books that she's been writing these letters, and we're like, ooh, what's going on? And we find out at the beginning of this book that she's been in correspondence with this man named Sir Philip Crane. And it started with her expressing condolences for his late wife, Marina. Which, this is where I'm coming full circle, because I know I said at the beginning of this video, I was like, I don't know what they took from later books to bring into earlier seasons of the show. And I've realized that Marina from season 1 is one of those characters. So Marina from the show, as we know, is the character who is a cousin of the Featheringtons, and she has a lover who is in the army. She is pregnant, and there's a lot of sort of plot lines that go with there, but at the end of it, we find out that her lover has died, and her lover's brother, Phillip, comes to marry her. And her lover's name was George, I think. And so Marina leaves with him, and that's sort of the end of her story in that first season. And I had always thought that she was just like a random addition to the story for season 1. But it turns out that Marina is an actual character in the books from specifically this book. So basically in the books, Marina is, once again, has this lover in the army named George. I don't know if they were like completely lovers, but they were engaged. And in the book, Marina is actually a cousin of the Bridgertons, not the Featheringtons. And George ends up dying in the war. And so his brother ends up marrying Marina instead. And I think in the book, there's no mention really of the fact that she's like pregnant before getting married and all of that. But in the book, she and Philip end up having twins, and they are his kids. But this is where things get a little strange. And I wasn't actually expecting this, but this happens in like the prologue, I think, of the book. But we find out that Marina has been basically depressed her entire life, and she ends up attempting to drown herself in the lake, and Philip saves her, but she ends up dying of the flu afterwards. And so there's this very heavy sort of start to this book, which I didn't really expect. But this is where Eloise comes in, because since Marina was her cousin, she sends a letter of condolence to Philip, because she just likes writing letters to everyone. And the two of them end up sort of striking up this correspondence, because he's thinking, well, he needs a new wife to be a mother to his children who he can't really manage. And things sort of snowball from there. And sort of the inciting incident for this book in particular, like in the current timeline, is when Sir Philip Crane sends her a letter and is like, you know, we've been talking for a year. I think maybe what if you visited me in my home in Romney Hall for a few weeks? We'll see if we suit each other, and then maybe we can get married because I need a wife and you're a spinster and you might want to get married and that kind of thing. And so that's what sort of sparks the beginning of this book. And this sort of happens at the same time that Eloise is sort of reeling from the knowledge that Penelope and Colin are getting married and that she's going to be a spinster by herself. And there's this huge element of Eloise feeling like she's been too picky with the suitors that she's turned down for all these years over like the past 10 years, which is something I never talked about in my review of Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, but it was so wild to me that it takes place so many years later, including this book. It takes place many years later after like the first book occurs. But yeah, there's a huge element of like sort of Eloise feeling slightly jealous of Penelope having moved on to this new chapter of her life. She always assumed that she would get married first rather than Penelope and that she wouldn't be alone like this, which I thought was like an interesting look into Eloise's character. I think personally I like Eloise better in the show. After having read this book, I like her better in the show. And I think there's an element of her being a bit more interesting, I guess, or a little bit different, I would say. One thing I really loved about Eloise in the first season was this like moment she has with Daphne where she's like totally disgusted by the concept of giving birth and sort of like the pain of it and all of that. And I could never imagine her having children of her own based off of that conversation. And so that is totally shattered in this book because in the epilogue of this book, she and Phillip end up having like their own natural child, aside from the two that he already had with Marina. And I was like, is this really true to Eloise's character? I know she's great with kids, but I don't know that she would want kids, at least in the version of her character I have in my head from the show. Hello my friends, I am just popping in here because I'm editing this video and just realized something of what I was trying to explain with Eloise's character. I think just based off of what I imagined her in my head and what I've seen in this show, I imagined her to be more like Jo March from Little Women. If you guys know that character from Little Women, she is the type of character who says that she never wants to get married, doesn't really want to have kids, and she is obsessed with her work and what she's doing and being independent, and that is the admirable part of her character. And I feel like Eloise has sort of always presented that aspect of herself in the show, at least. Like, she has so many discussions with Penelope about how she's apprehensive and doesn't want to get married and have this life and be with child, and is so mortified by this whole situation of having to go out into society and everything in her next year. And I don't know if I would actually enjoy seeing her character change into someone who would want marriage. I think that's what sort of disappointed me about this book. I expected her to sort of stick to her guns about not wanting marriage or not wanting, you know, children that much, and just, you know, sticking to her guns about being a spinster. But I mean, I guess it was also realistic that she felt lonely and that she wanted to get married eventually and all of these things. But I just, in my head, love independent Eloise and just being her awesome self. So yeah, I think that's what disappointed me about her character. And now back to me talking about the rest of my thoughts on this book. I think I just had like high expectations for this book with Eloise and sort of a romance as well, because the second I heard that it was letters that brings them together, I was like, oh, this is gonna be so romantic. But it ended up being not that romantic, I think. And the letters part sort of occurs at the beginning, and then they're sort of meeting at Romney Hall, and everything felt just very like, here we are, you know, we both need to get married kind of thing. And that's sort of how it happens. Another thing that I was like noticing was that this book, and basically every book in the series so far, has used the same trick every single time, where it's like the characters end up in a compromising position, or they end up in a situation where they've been like unsupervised or whatever, and they end up having to get married because they've ruined the girl's reputation, or are potentially ruining the girl's reputation. The only book that doesn't do that is An Offer from a Gentleman, which is Benedict's story, which is one of my favorites out of the series. And I think that was particularly why I liked it so much, because it felt a lot different from the other books. It had its own gimmicks, and it wasn't the same gimmicks as the other books. Aside from that, one of the highlights of this book was the part where Anthony, Colin, Benedict, and Gregory come to sort of save Eloise at Romney Hall because she sort of run away without telling anyone anything. And that whole sequence of scenes where they're there at Romney Hall and sort of interrogating Phillip and being slightly mean to him, but then later like drinking with him, and all of their little interactions was really fun. I also loved seeing more Benedict and Sophie in this book, who are the main couple in An Offer from a Gentleman. And they sort of disappear in Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, but they come back in this one, which was nice. Another thing I noticed was that I actually really started to like Anthony in this book. I was starting to like him more after The Viscount Who Loved Me, but I think I've just come to this acceptance that I like him when he becomes a little bit older. Like when he was younger in like the first book, he was really annoying, and even in the first season, but I think he's matured a lot, which I appreciate, and I think Kate has to do with that. So I absolutely loved seeing him and hearing him talk about his marriage with Kate and everything, and it was just really great. And I love the relationship that he has with all of his siblings and the way that he's just like trying to take care of them as the sort of head of the family. I did really like Sir Philip Crane's children in this book. They were very cute, and I love the aspect of Eloise sort of connecting with them, so I liked that part of the story. I just think there was no chemistry between her and Sir Philip. Like, I just didn't see it, and I wanted more for Eloise, at least. If she was gonna like finally get married, I wanted it to be like epic, and it wasn't, so here we are. I still think this was an enjoyable book, and I by no means think it was terrible, but it definitely wasn't like one of my favorites. And with that said, that's about all of my thoughts on this book in particular. I am going to now wrap up my thoughts on all 5 books that I read in the series. I plan to continue with the series later on, but I do think I need a little break in the series right now because I feel like I've just been reading too many of these like Regency romances, and I'm starting to get sort of tired of the same things happening. I feel like if I come back to the rest of the series later on, I'll be a little bit more excited for it, probably closer to the next seasons when there's more of those side characters coming in. So with that said, let's get into ranking these books and sort of giving you my final thoughts. Alrighty, so on to my final thoughts of these like 5 first books in the Bridgerton series, and also some of my theories for season 2. I know this video will probably go up right when season 2 drops, so we'll see if I end up being right about any of these theories. But I did want to start by ranking each of these books in relation to each other based on how I personally enjoyed them. So I think in place number 4 and 5, I definitely have to put the last 2 books that I read, Romancing Mr. Bridgerton and To Sir Philip with Love, so Penelope and Colin's story and Eloise's story. There's just something about both these books where there was a lot of like great moments between some of the characters and like the different siblings and stuff, but I felt like the romances themselves just really fell flat for me, and I didn't really get the chemistry between the characters, and I just wanted more out of them. I also just didn't really like the male characters in these books. I didn't particularly love Colin in Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. I just didn't like how he was getting jealous. And I didn't really love Sir Philip in this one just because he had like some anger issues, and also I didn't love the way that he talked about his relationship with Marina. I know it was very complicated because he was someone sort of dealing with a sort of spouse who was dealing with a lot of depression and couldn't be there in like a significant way with him, but still there was something about the handling of that that I didn't enjoy or like. And I feel like these 2 books also fell flat for me in terms of the way that the main characters were acting or sort of characterized in this book. I don't know how to explain this, but I feel like I enjoyed Penelope and Eloise a little bit more in the show, and I wish they were a little bit more like themselves in the show. But I don't know, the romances just didn't do it for me for these 2, so I feel like that's why they are definitely the last place for me in terms of these 5 books. Surprisingly, in 3rd place, I have to put The Duke and I. Although I don't love this one in terms of how repetitive the story gets, and also how annoying the characters get towards the end of the book and how sort of sad it is, and also like all of the problematic shit that happens in this book to do with the consent and everything. But I do think that the romance in this one is a lot better than the later 2 books, just because the chemistry between Daphne and Simon is like off the charts from the beginning. I feel like they have really great banter, some really great moments together as well, and I just loved reading about them and like wanted to know what was gonna happen next, even though I sort of knew it already from the show. But I still felt like, despite having watched the show and like known how their story ends, I still found the book really compelling and interesting to read their story. So I did like them each as a character and like the way that they fall in love. So I feel like that's like a really important part for these books, and the fact that they are romances. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed these 2 in this book and sort of their individual character growth as well. I will say though that the problematic shit, the repetitiveness, and the strange way that this sort of ends off wasn't my favorite. So this is like slightly above those other 2 just because of like the chemistry between the characters, but not far above the other 2. I do think that the later books do have like better moments between the other siblings and like side characters, so I enjoyed a lot of those aspects, which this one doesn't have too much of. There's a lot of great moments between Daphne and like Antony in this book, but aside from that, there's not much of like the side characters. So take this with a grain of salt in terms of like the romance. When I'm saying that, it's not that I love what happens between these characters, it's that I like Simon as a love interest better, and I love their chemistry better. Like, I really did not like Colin as a love interest in Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. There was just something about him that I was like, I don't find you attractive, and I feel like Penelope could do better. And then Sir Philip in here, I feel like we get a lot of details about him and his backstory dropped in much later in the book, but I don't know, I didn't find him also attractive as a love interest, and I didn't really see what Eloise was seeing in him because he was also like kind of a terrible father for most of the book, and I know he's trying, but I didn't really empathize with him all that much. Alrighty, so after I just harped on like those 3 books, now we get into my 2 favorites of the series, and honestly I feel like these 2 books are like a cut above the rest. They were so much better than the other 3, and I feel like they felt so much different that like I could believe that they were kind of written by a different person, because I don't know what it was about them, but the characters, I loved each of the love interests and the main characters as well. Love them to pieces, and I love the way that they fall in love as well. I think the stories in these ones were just a lot more compelling. So those 2 books obviously are The Viscount Who Loved Me and An Offer from a Gentleman. I mentioned in my review of An Offer from a Gentleman, but I really loved how this one was like sort of a Cinderella story, and all the conflict that comes between the characters is really sort of a factor of things larger than themselves, you know, class and society and all of that. I also mentioned this in my review of To Sir Philip with Love, but this is the one book in the series that doesn't use the gimmick where the 2 characters are found in a compromising position and so they're forced to get married. That happens in every single one of the books except for this one. Something that happens in most of the other books. They get married pretty early in the book and then they're still trying to figure out their feelings afterwards. But I feel like this one was definitely like the traditional story of where the marriage comes at the very end. So I kind of like that just because it didn't feel so similar to the other books. And also this one just had like a lot more plot to it and a lot of fun little things going on. It also had a lot of the side characters in it, which I loved seeing. And I just really loved Sophie as a character as well. She was such an endearing heroine. And I also really loved Benedict. Benedict was like a little bit of an arrogant ass, and I do not think he's the epitome of like a great guy, but he was like a pretty great love interest, and I did like him as a character. He's also really funny. I think that's what I liked about him the most out of all of the love interests, or like male Bridgertons. He was the funniest, and I just really loved reading about him and sort of seeing him interact with Sophie. I just loved their banter and everything that they do. I think out of all of them, the reading experience for me for this one was just so enjoyable, which is why it like stands above most of the rest of them. And then of course we also have The Viscount Who Loved Me. And this one was equally fantastic. I think the only reason that this one gets like a few docked points is because it's very similar to the other ones in the sense that like she uses very similar gimmicks, like getting caught in a compromising position, and also Antony's stupid anger problems and stuff. I think he is a lot better in this book, and I loved getting the insight into his character and like the grief that he has over his father. And I love that he and Kate sort of connect over their shared grief as well. Kate as a character was fantastic, and I loved sort of the hate to love trope that was going on in this book, like the enemies to lovers situation. And I loved like the whole situation with Kate's sister as well, Edwina. I loved Edwina as a character. I know they're planning to play up the love triangle in the 2nd season, which is fine, but I did personally like the way that Edwina was mostly uninterested in Antony for literally all of the book. I thought that that was just so fun. And I feel like this book was a really nice sort of situation where Kate got to take Antony down by a few pegs, which was really nice to see after like he's so much of an ass in the first book and season. So I'm excited to see that on screen as well. I think the romances in these 2 books were just so compelling, and like the chemistry between the characters was just off the charts. So they definitely are my favorites in the series. And with that said, I feel like those are my like overall thoughts on the books themselves. This video is probably going to go up like right before or right after the show comes out, and I'll be binging it right away and hopefully giving you guys a review sometime soon. But that's about all I have to say. This was a really long, rambly video where I talked about all my thoughts for these books, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you have read the books, I would love to hear all of your thoughts. If you are just someone who watched the 1st or 2nd season of the show and want to know more about the books and are watching this video, I would love to know what you're surprised about that I told you about in this video, because I feel like this is definitely a lot of spoilers for the books. So I would love to hear what you're sort of feeling and thinking and what you're excited for in future seasons. I had so much fun doing this, and hopefully I can do a part 2 of this with the rest of the series when we get closer to those characters' stories in the show as well, because I feel like they're very minor characters right now, Hyacinth, Francesca, Gregory, because they're all so young. But I'm excited to see them grow up and sort of their stories later on. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this. And if you don't follow me already on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, and TikTok, definitely go check out those links down below, because I usually update you guys on my reading and my regular life on the daily. I will see you in my next video, and please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!